Farah, what does the Muslim community in general, how does this affect them? What do they think about it?
So you've seen all kinds of voices since September 11th talk about this issue, but it's on a very micro level, and there are two pieces of this. One is what governments need to hear around the world. They want to hear the clerics and the university leaders and the so-called right Muslims speak up. And that's important and it's symbolic, and they certainly did that here in the Paris attacks. But what you don't hear are those that are the nuanced voices, the hip-hop artists, the people that we don't generally look at and say they count. But actually they do count. Do you know any 16-year-old kid who's listening to their parents about what should happen? No. They're listening to their peers. And it's the peers that matter. And what we have to do is talent scout around the world and lift up the voices that are actually making a difference for these kids. The communicators are putting the message out, but it's the audience that's absorbing the narrative of the extremists that have to be cut off, and we have to be more creative about how we do it. A network that we know about, that you talked about in terms of the formers, the Against Violent Extremism Network, which is a really powerful network of former extremists of all kinds talking in a credible way about why they did what they did and how they came back. What would happen if you amplify them in a gigantic way? David, do you think the government and the Congress will see this as a serious threat, or will Congress just fall back into this dysfunction that we've become so accustomed to?
Listening to Congressman McCall, listening to Senator Cornyn, listening to any political voice, I think there's a recognition this is a big problem. I think as we look back 14 years to our experience after 9/11, we do need to think, how do we respond to it without overreacting, without doing things that make the problem worse? And I think the kinds of things that Farah is talking about that I mentioned earlier, where it's not the U.S. blaring that it's a war on terror, which is read in the Muslim world as a war on Muslims. It's subtler, and it's trying to work out through these soft power things that are pervasive, global. Trying to do it in a smarter way this time around. So I hope that Congress, as it gets mobilized, doesn't make the problem worse by adding things that turn this into a megaphone as opposed to something more subtle.
All right. Well, thanks to all three of you this morning. Very enlightening. And to talk now about some of the other news of the week, we're joined by Ruth Marcus, columnist for the Washington Post, Jim Vandehei, the president and CEO of Politico, and Peter Baker, who covers the White House for the New York Times. So, Ruth, does this change events here in Washington, what we saw happening in Paris this week?
I think it renews the realization of something that we've known all along, which is we are, as you were asking, entering a new phase in the war on terror, which is that there is a constant threat, not of 9/11 type incidents, but of smaller incidents. And honestly, we've been lucky that they have been relatively few so far, and we just need to be constantly vigilant. In the very short term, you saw it in the conversation you were having with the Senator Cornyn and Congressman McCall. There's a tension between Washington's desire to show it can get something done, and specifically with the pending funding of Department of Homeland Security, and its desire to express, Republicans' desire to express their displeasure with the president. I think this particular episode really ramps up the pressure to make sure there is no funding shortfall.
Let me just bring up something that nobody has talked about much, and that is on this whole journalism front. I mean, I personally am not one for making fun of anybody's religion. I mean, I just don't think those kinds of things are funny. But I think it is so important to separate satire and say, well, I don't like that, from the question of, well, they certainly have a right to express their opinion, and that's part of the foundation of our Western values and stuff. Is this a problem for journalism, Jim?
I mean, I think, listen, we're talking about free speech. It's always a problem, and there's things that you have to tolerate, nasty stuff. I mean, it's not that those cartoons weren't just nasty towards Muslims, they're nasty towards Jews and Christians as well. So all of us would probably be offended by some of them. But at the end of the day, we're all in this business because we believe fully in freedom of speech. To Ruth's point, I think one of the things that's getting lost in all of this, and maybe there's a good transition into 2016, is all these debates still seem small. Are we going to have more TSA funding? Are we going to have better coordination with other countries on watch lists? Like, ultimately, the reality is this is us forever. We're always going to be under this threat of attack, and you almost have to have a new debate about how do you set up laws and how do you set up international relationships to deal with the fact that technology makes it so much easier for people to kill us and then to broadcast it in very spectacular ways. And we saw it with the Sony hack. You can use technology to do it that way. You can behead somebody, throw it up on Twitter, and have millions of people watch nasty, awful, brutal things. So how do you combat that? And it feels like we're at the very early stages of that.
You know, I think, though, that one of the most heartening things is this morning to turn on the television and see 1 million people have turned out on the streets of Paris. We talk about messaging. That seems to be a pretty powerful message.
Well, it's a very powerful message, and it reminds you of the moment after 9/11 when the French were so supportive of us and what we had gone through. They said in their headline in the Le Monde editorial, "We're all Americans today." And that sort of solidarity does send a message. You don't get Abbas and Netanyahu on the same square block, much less the same protest very often or demonstration very often. I think in expanding on what Ruth and Jim just said, the other thing about this in our context is it comes in a moment where we're already debating what is too far. Right. This comes right after the torture report from the Senate. It comes right in the middle of a continuing debate about the NSA. How far should we be going toward combating terrorism? This reminds us the threat is real. How do you find the right calibration? And we're 14 years in, still trying to figure out that right balance.
Let's talk. Go ahead, Ruth.
No. Well, I mean, we're having two debates about what is too far. What is too far in terms of surveillance? And I guarantee you that in 6 months or a year, we'll have stories about infiltration of mosques and Muslim groups, and we'll be agonizing about that, but we'd be agonizing the other way. There's also a very important journalistic debate that you brought up about what is too far in terms of the interview, what is too far in terms of these cartoons, which are offensive. Our newspapers, none of them would have run them on their own. We made different choices in the different newspapers to run them afterwards. I personally watched the interview, which I never would have done, absent the controversy over it.
How was it, by the way?
I think I should withhold judgment, let you watch for yourself. But I think it's very important. It goes to the 1 million people out in the streets in Paris. When people are killed for expressing free speech, we have a responsibility to rally and err on the side of supporting that free speech, even when it's offensive.
You said just a minute ago, Jim, this may be a lead-in to talk about 2016, and people are already talking about 2016. I guess the big news of the week is it now looks pretty certain that Jeb Bush is going to run, but it's now looking more and more like Mitt Romney is going to run. And I remember when I was the only person in America who said
we heard you first.
Mitt Romney might try it for a third time. What are things?
Politics in a moment like this seems small, but I do think it was an important week in politics in that you have Jeb Bush, and for all the criticism you could give him, he's been pretty clever, getting in earlier than people thought, been savvy on social media, doing things in a bilingual way, and sticking to this idea that I'm going to take on my own party on some of the tough issues. Mitt Romney seems jealous, so he starts calling people and saying, hey, I might run too, and it looks like he might actually do it. But you have Scott Walker hiring up. He's about to go to Iowa. You have Rand Paul is definitely going to get in. You have Chris Christie, who's going to be able to raise money and probably to jump in. There's a formidable group of people. On the Christie thing, I do hope that he leaves Wisconsin today with his buddy Jerry Jones, both frozen and depressed, though, because we want.
Well, you know, I'm feeling so strong after predicting that Mitt Romney would run. I'm beginning to think Elizabeth Warren is going to run on the Democratic side. What do you think, Peter?
Well, you know, the problem is she doesn't have at the moment a viable path to the nomination, at least clear and ahead of her. She is, though, affecting that nomination process, whether she runs or not, right? She is already pulling Hillary Clinton a little bit to the left the way a challenger would. In some ways, it doesn't really matter if she runs as long as she's out there giving voice to the ideas that her part of the party wants to hear voiced. And
Bob, I'm going to take the incredible risk of maybe disagreeing with you on both fronts. I don't think Elizabeth Warren's going to run for the reasons that Peter said, but she is an enormously powerful voice in the Democratic Party, and she's going to use that for all it's worth and for all the hassle it's going to cause to the president over the next few years. I am not so sure that Mitt Romney is going to run. I do think that his comments this week really freeze the field for the moment. Bush is in, Romney might be in. I think the one it has actually the worst impact on this week is Chris Christie in the short term, because with a Romney and a Bush in there, that really occupies the field of potential 2016 donors and causes Christie additional problems. If Romney stays in, Bush-Romney, that's a really interesting conundrum for Jeb Bush, because that makes him look like the leftward person in the field, and that is not the easiest path to a primary win for him.
Certainly, we'll all stay tuned. Thank you all. It's been fun to talk to you on a pretty grim day. It's fun to have a little fun. If the motive of the killers who launched the attacks in Paris was to get the world's attention, they succeeded, but perhaps not in the way they had wished. Support and solidarity for their victims spread immediately across France. "We're not afraid," the people said. They held up pencils and pens, the weapons the terrorists had tried to disarm. Within hours, demonstrations of support had spread around the world, across Europe to Union Square in New York, from Russia to Mexico, and even Kathmandu in Nepal. People wrote words on their arms in Brazil and carved sand sculptures in India to show their support. Civilized people understood that this was not an attack on a small newspaper, but an attack on the values that are the foundation of our way of life. It was an attack on us all. This was a tragedy, but the terrorists did not advance their cause. As those powerful pictures affirmed, they heard it in every corner of the world. That is it for us today. Be sure to tune in tonight to the CBS Evening News and CBS This Morning tomorrow for more on the rally in Paris, which is where we leave you now. Thank you for watching. Today's guests were Attorney General Eric Holder, House Homeland Security Committee Chairman Michael McCall, and Senate Assistant Majority Leader John Cornyn. The executive producer of Face the Nation is Mary Hager. The senior producers are Rob Hendon and Jill Jackson. This broadcast was directed by Sue Ann Stocky Wayne. Face the Nation originates from CBS News in Washington. For more Face the Nation, we're online at facethenation.com, and you can follow Face the Nation, Bob Schieffer, and CBS Radio News on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
Jesus, Jesus, something special, something special, supernatural about your name, Jesus. Something happens. Something happens when I mention your name. When I mention your name. Demons have to flee when I say Jesus. Jesus. Sickness has to heal when I say Jesus. Jesus. Every knee shall bow before, and every tongue proclaim with the word they praise that matchless name of Jesus. Something special, so supernatural. Jesus, something happened when I mentioned Jesus, 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 Jesus. Something happens when I call you. When I can't call on anybody else, it's Jesus. When my situation looked like it